and it exists in the Netherlands. And what most people don't know is even though Red Cross just started working on climate change in the United States, 20 years ago, the center was founded. And it's been working around climate change forever. She has worked at Tufts University. She's a fellow at Tufts. Is that correct? Did I say it right? And she has numerous experiences in terms of working with global climate change and supporting, especially in strategic planning for the United States. She's helped quite a bit. And then I also want to introduce Moshimi. Did I pronounce it right?
Close. It's Moshimi.
Moshimi, who is offered to come and speak with Julie. And she has had a lot of experience in Africa and South Asia and comes from Bangladesh and also is working on strategic planning. She's been doing consultancy for NGOs and government agencies all over the world. And as always, I leave something out in the introduction, but I'm so pleased and happy that both of you are here today. And I'm so grateful that you come because this is one of the things that is happening in the world that makes it very difficult. And unusual to us, I usually introduce and ask the questions. In this particular time, Julie is going to be interviewing Moshimi, and Moshimi is going to be interviewing Julie and asking the questions. And I've told him what I wanted the first question to be. So without any further ado, we're going to start. And thank you for being here. Really appreciative. We have this discussion group every single month with speakers from all over the world. Go for it, Julie, or whoever wants to
Thanks,
start.
Jill.
To me.
So we'll start with the question that Jill has requested, which is familiar to anyone who's joined this call before. Today's iteration of it is, Mushumi, when you were in high school, what did you think you would be? And then how did you go from there to here? Unless it's exactly what you thought you would be, and then that would be interesting to hear as well.
Thank you, Julie. Really happy to be here with all of you today. That's a great question to start with. I think for like most people, I didn't have like an exact understanding or an idea of what I wanted to be, but I think I did want to be in sort of the international development world. And that's partly because I grew up in an international development family. I grew up in Asia and Africa where, issues like environmental degradation and poverty, these are still really big factors. And so I think growing up in that kind of context, it really made me, want to, get my education and get professional experience, focusing on, three areas, I guess. That's, people's well-being, environmental governance, and climate adaptation. So I feel like, these are the themes that have kind of cross-cut throughout my career in some shape or form. I think the other things that, really influenced me living in developing countries in particular was sort of the issues of equity and looking at, let's say, gender or age, which create different types of vulnerabilities for different people. And this is sort of the angle I took with my work, having, again, like just being influenced by these issues on a day-to-day basis. So for instance, prior to joining the Red Cross, I was with CARE, and I was there as the Senior Technical Advisor in Climate Justice, where I had the opportunity to make sure that, very poor women would be benefiting from climate interventions, for instance. The other thing that I really wanted from a young age, let's say high school onwards, is to focus on science and research. I think that's really the backbone, in my opinion, in terms of, what should enable us to make good decisions. So I've spent a lot of my career, translating science into, let's say, climate adaptation tools that help us make decisions. And I did a lot of that when I was at the World Resources Institute, and really focusing on helping governments in different parts of the world and stakeholders there to really understand, okay, what are the tools available? How can we integrate science into creating solutions, climate solutions in particular? And I guess the one last thing that I would want to say here is that, I think even though I've recently joined the Red Cross, it's only been 3 months. I feel like, most of my career, I've been focusing on sort of the long-term adaptation or the prevention part of things. And I'm happy to be at the Red Cross where I can connect the dots in a way from the prevention work that I've done to the preparedness and response and recovery work that the American Red Cross does so well. So I'll stop there and ask you the same question, Julie. What did you want to be when you grew up or graduated from high school?
Yeah, thanks. Really fascinating story and how all the pieces have come together. I'm also really happy to be here and chatting with all of you over the next bit of time. When I mean, there are lots of different things, but when I was graduating high school, I was absolutely convinced that I wanted to be a physicist. And I chose the university that I went to as a strictly like science and engineering university. People tried to warn me that maybe physics won't be the thing that you like want to do long term when you experience other things, but I was so convinced. And then it was around my third year where I still loved the subject, but I realized I wanted to do something that connected more to society in a different way. But I was at this science and engineering school, right? So the closest I could get to humanities was to, well, engineering would have taken a bit longer to adjust. That's obviously very close to society, but I made a shift over to water, hydrology as a degree. And then after that, switched to climate science and its impact on society in my master's. And that kind of then set the trajectory that we go from there to today. So I've been working on climate change and its impact on society ever since. After my master's, I already started with the Red Cross. So I've been with the Red Cross for a while. I was with the Red Cross in Uganda. This was back in 2009. Helping them to develop their climate change adaptation strategy was the first thing I did. Climate change was very nascent in the Red Cross Red Crescent at that point. Like Jill said, the Climate Center had just been founded a few years before then. And then, different steps from there, but essentially various roles, and ended up in the one I'm in now, which is in this shared position with the Climate Center and the American Red Cross, focusing on partnerships for the American Red Cross and the International Services Division, and then director of the programs at the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center, which is an exciting way to bring together these science and society threads in what we're doing and how we can support the Red Cross Red Crescent network and other partners. So yeah.
That's very cool, Julie. Julie and I feel like you and I have met over the years at different points, excuse me, in our careers. And I didn't know that you studied hydrology and you were interested in physics. So that's very cool. And I'm glad you're able to bring science to the table. So kind of, yeah, I mean, that sounds amazing.
Yeah, thanks. It's been great to find that combination.
Yeah.
So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I kind of, I guess, in relation to, science, one of the things that we focus on is extreme heat. And I know that you've worked a lot in this sector on extreme heat, and it's a priority for us. What are some of the key milestones in our history of engaging on this topic?
Yeah, so I think extreme heat is such a relevant question, not only from our strategic interest in the international team, which might be of interest to some folks on the call, but also just being in July, having just come through some pretty extreme heat events, not only in the US, but also in Europe as well. Extreme heat is rapidly on the rise due to climate change and a major challenge in terms of being the deadliest disaster in many countries, including the US. But some of our milestones working in this area, we, together with the Climate Center, the American Red Cross published a heatwave guide for cities already back in 2019. So really, as the topic was emerging as an area of interest for the Red Cross Red Crescent Network. I'll just pick a couple of milestones. There would be a lot to mention. Some of you may remember the Pacific Northwest Heat Dome that happened in 2021. We worked with a group of research partners to do an attribution study of that, which essentially was looking at whether or not climate change played a role in the event and to what degree it would have played a role, and basically found that that event was essentially impossible in a world without climate change. So that was a really landmark study at that time. Some of you may be aware of Global Heat Action Day. That was this past June, and American Red Cross with the Federation and the Climate Center were part of founding that day back in 2021. So we're excited to have seen it grow over the years with lots of partners, hundreds of partners engaging within and beyond the Red Cross every year. While it's not international, I think it's amazing to see how the work has grown domestically as well, with really great work going on in Arizona and the DC metro area from the chapters there in terms of raising awareness about extreme heat and understanding its, profile in the community in terms of geospatially as well. And then I guess the last one I would add to this short milestone list would be our work with other national societies. So we've been doing a lot of piloting of improving heat early warning systems and heat action plans and community level adaptation with national societies in Honduras and Tanzania, Indonesia, Nepal, among others. And that really segues me over to the question I want to ask you, which is you just came back from one of these convenings in Asia Pacific in Bangkok, where many national societies were convened to develop heat action plans, a heat action plan right shop to sort of develop this unified approach. It'd be amazing if you could maybe tell us what heat action plans are, and then also your insights and learnings from that event, because it's such an important topic of the day.
Thanks so much for that question, Julie. I mean, I think the heat work. I mean, thank you for your leadership, first of all, on this, because I think it's really grown over the years, and I'm really happy to see so many countries engaged. And one of the things they're engaged in is developing these heat action plans, which is essentially kind of ways to bring together. One thing that National Society does is bring stakeholders together to really figure out, what are the best ways, what are the solutions that people can take to respond when there's a heat wave, for instance, and of course to prepare for heat waves. So what are the steps that they can take? Who should be doing what? When should people be sort of encouraged to go to the cooling center, for instance? So it's really literally a plan of who should do what when, in terms of both preparedness and response. And of course, there's a methodology behind all of this. There's steps to it. So one of the things that we did in Asia Pacific is really bring together national societies that have a lot of experience in developing these heat action plans from Bangladesh, Nepal, and Indonesia, and then countries in Asia Pacific that are super interested in developing these heat action plans, or HAPs as we call them. So countries such as Vietnam, Myanmar, Singapore, Thailand, Australia. I think there's also someone from South Korea. So it was really wide ranging. And so the idea was to really couple of things. One is to help those national societies that are kind of new to the HAPs and help them engage with national societies that have already done this. So really share best practices, what works, what doesn't work in terms of the methodology in particular. And how the process can be simplified, because it's pretty challenging to bring together multiple stakeholders, including the municipality government, local government, to come together and really think about common solutions, what everyone wants to do and should be implementing. So it was really excellent discussion and exchange of knowledge across these very, very different contexts. Even though everyone is facing extreme heat, the context of decision making is very different, and so we talked a lot about that. And in relation to that, because the contexts are different, we were talking about how the methodology itself needs to be standardized, so it's kind of similar, but yet also adaptable to local context. I think that was one of the sort of the critical pieces that came out. The other is, to think about like, to have a systems thinking approach. And what I mean by that is, heat is something that affects many different sectors. It affects the health sector. It's kind of obvious. The health one is kind of obvious in the sense that, we have a heat stroke and we have to go to the hospital, for instance. But there are other sectors that could be, heavily impacted, such as the energy sector. There's a lot of, so like the electric grid might be, might not be working when it's extremely hot. So, and then how does it affect sort of the different economic sectors? Livelihoods are affected. People aren't able to go outside and work, for instance. So the idea really is to bring all these different, not just stakeholders, but different sectors together. I mean, that's challenging, but I think that's another critical thing that came out, that we really need to think about sort of cross-cutting sectors, think about things at a systemic or systems level. And the other thing I came out with is, I think it's fantastic that, we're doing all these, heat action planning. I think that's a really, really important first step. But I think maybe over the next few years, once heat action plans are implemented, we really need to capture the learning and the evidence of the impact that these heat action plans have made, because that's really important in terms of, not only shaping the next iteration of the plan itself, but to also really encourage cities that have not yet really thought about doing heat action plans that they can have an impact. So I think those are the few sort of high level things that I came out with. So staying on the heat theme, Julie, since you've been involved in this area for a while, what's on the horizon for extreme heat work globally?
Yeah, there's a couple of things for sure, and one that I hope as well. One of the things that builds really well on the reflections you were just sharing in terms of, how heat action plans bring together different sectors with the, outlining what each entity needs to do. There's a topic called heat governance, which kind of builds on that concept of how do you bring together different, departments or ministries of government, agencies in our case, in terms of governing all of these wide-reaching impacts of extreme heat. So heat governance has become a very trendy topic right now, still emerging, and there'll be a lot going on globally over the coming years in that space. One of the challenges that the extreme heat space has faced, which is why this is a trendy topic at the moment, is because if you sort of house it in the climate space, like your National Weather Service, then you get really good information about like the peaks of the temperature, but you may miss that electricity sector impact, right? But if you house it in the health sector, then your weather agency might be less involved, and this will vary country to country, of course. So establishing these governance approaches to address that like whole of society dimension. Another thing that there is increasing recognition of, and it's especially critical outside of the US for sure, but also within the US to a degree, is this concept of indoor heat. So we think about extreme heat as being that intense temperature that you feel when you go outside, but indoor heat is a very critical issue as well. If you have air conditioning or some sort of temperature control, it's less of a concern, but that's contingent on the fact that you can afford to turn it on and that you are basically operating that air conditioning. But more generally, outside of places with air conditioning, the concept of indoor heat is really critical because buildings will absorb heat during prolonged extreme heat events, and they start to radiate it back, or they absorb it and they don't release it at night. And so you can end up with temperatures that keep going up and up, especially overnight temperatures, which can be more detrimental to human health. And then when you combine that with people who might have physiological conditions like lung conditions or heart conditions, et cetera, that make them more vulnerable to heat, maybe they're isolated, so someone's not necessarily checking on them, it can become this like perfect storm of extremely high risk that can be unfortunately quite deadly. So we'll see a lot more in indoor heat risk, and also how can we think about supportive systems for people to reduce their indoor heat risk. I think this, I mentioned at the beginning that we're just coming out of this extreme heat event a couple of weeks ago in the US that was basically over half of the country. I think that is here to stay, right? We'll continue to see these unprecedented events in terms of their scale, in terms of their temperature, and they will continue to be unprecedented. So that will pose really interesting challenges for a response organization as well. What does it mean to be dealing with these sorts of events? And that relates to the last thing I would say, which I hope we will see, which is that in many countries in the world, extreme heat isn't classified as a disaster, including in the US. And so there are certain mechanisms, as we all know, that when an event is classified as a disaster, you can access states of emergency and these other sort of mechanisms. And I'm not a policy expert from this nuanced dimension, but I think we'll see, I hope we see progress in the disaster law space in terms of recognizing that extreme heat is not just like the season that we should be used to, but rather has these very extreme moments that we need to have a more concerted preparedness and response effort around to reduce impacts. So yeah, we'll see. I don't know, but those are a couple of things in mind. Shifting now off the extreme heat topic, but staying on the idea of like horizons and innovations. You mentioned at the beginning that you joined in April, about 3 months ago, but you come with such a long history of working for many different organizations, different types of backgrounds, doing different innovative things. 3 months is enough time to get that like solid first glimpse into the Red Cross, right? So I would love to hear from your perspective. What are some of those innovations or learnings or insights that you bring with you to the Red Cross that you think the Red Cross could consider incorporating into its work? And it doesn't need to be heat related; it can be across the board.
Right. Thanks, Julie. That's a really interesting question. I mean, there's so much innovation out there, and it also depends on what you think is innovative. I think that's also up for debate, but I guess maybe because my background is I come from the environmental world, the environment sector, and so just speaking from that perspective, I mean, there are two things that I think are quite innovative, and I would love to see the American Red Cross do more of, and that's related to nature-based solutions. I think that's one of something that I've been working on for over the years, and it's essentially about protecting nature, protecting ecosystems, so that they, provide us with a range of benefits. And one of the key benefits is, of course, reducing the impacts of climate hazards. So let's say if you conserve a mangrove forest or a coral reef, that can really help us reduce sort of the impact of high speed winds that are coming in with a storm, or coastal flooding that happens after a storm. So, and of course, nature-based solutions provide multiple benefits. In addition to reducing our climate risks, they offer livelihood opportunities for millions of people around the world. So, just coming from that angle, I think one of the innovative things that I actually worked on while I was with the Nature Conservancy actually is insurance for natural infrastructure. And what that means is, this is very much a pilot in a way. It's taken off in a couple of places, but it's really, I would say, still innovative and still new, in the sense, it's about ensuring an ecosystem. For instance, ensuring a coral reef. And if there's a hurricane or a storm coming, and it reaches a certain threshold, certain speed, it triggers finance to help protect coral reefs, so that they can, again, provide us with as much benefits as possible in terms of reducing that climate risks that people, especially in coastal areas, face. And this is innovative because, you usually don't think of insurance companies, really working with ecologists on coral reefs, or social scientists who work with people, or economists. So I think I like this idea because it brings together, sort of unexpected stakeholders to the table, first of all. And it has real potential in terms of, because I think one of the things that we struggle with is, finance, right? We just sometimes just don't have enough money to implement climate solutions. And this is one method where an insurance payout could help protect those reefs and therefore help protect people living along the coast. And I think this idea is can be quite transferable in the American Red Cross context, because we already do sort of prearranged financing, right? Like paying out once a disaster strikes. And we do that with the cash and voucher assistance program. That's been really effective. It provides people with finances that they need to meet their immediate needs. So it's kind of along the same principle in terms of having a prearranged finance before a disaster strikes. And I think that, we can do this with insurance companies as well. And the other thing I would say, related to nature-based solutions, which is something that, the American Red Cross has been involved in, and I would, I hope that this area grows. And I know that, domestically, I think there's been some work done on hurricane and flood work along the Gulf and Atlantic coasts. And so I'm really hoping that these kinds of sort of nature-based solutions would be sort of maybe more prevalent in the work that we do going forward. So that would be my innovative sort of what I could bring to the table, or what would be interesting to do.
Maybe I can sneak in a follow-up question there,
Yeah,
'cause
please.
there's such interesting topics. When thinking about these innovations, like what are some of the key, you mentioned some key organizations, but what are some of the key partners that you would see engaging in those innovations? And also
Yeah.
just more generally, like strategies for partnerships, what advice would you give in building partnerships?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question, Julie. So, I mean, in terms of partnerships, like, whether it's nature-based solutions or otherwise, I think the idea is to really ensure that we have different types of partners at the table, so that we kind of build on each other's strengths and what we have to offer. So for instance, I mean, I would first of all look internally. So for instance, the Red Crescent, the Climate Center, essentially, is a great resource in terms of finding out, who those partners could be, whether it's for nature-based solutions or otherwise. I feel like it's like maybe the fastest way to understand, who is involved on a particular issue and who should be at the table. Because I'm really for science and research, I would, really encourage science and research partners to come to the table, whether that's universities. I mean, we work a lot with universities already to help. Recently, I was reviewing a report that the University of the Arizona State University did on actually the heat action plans. So bringing sort of a scientific approach and a technical approach to what we do, I think is really critical, so that we have that rigor and our decisions and our solutions are science-based. I would say bringing in the private sector. I mean, again, like I don't know if we do that often, but like I said, like in my example, insurance companies, they're the private sector. That could be an interesting partner to work with. Of course, you need government at the table. Whether that's at the national level or local level, because I think there really are a very strong gatekeeper in terms of what we can and cannot do in a particular community. And then that brings me to the other type of partner that I would look for are maybe civil society organizations, who really represent local voices, because I think it's, I think we take the locally led action approach at the American Red Cross, where we want those marginalized voices at the table so that they can help create solutions alongside everybody else, and that their needs are met in terms of those solutions that we develop. So I think those are like the main types of partners that I would go with. But in terms of strategy, I think I think like in any partnership, it has to be mutually beneficial, right? It's not just about us going to somebody and saying, okay, what can you offer me? Like, what kind of gap can you help me fill? That it's not about that. It's really trying to find sort of like a mutual or common ground in terms of offer. What does American Red Cross offer compared to a partner, for instance, the World Wildlife Fund? We have a memorandum of understanding with the World Wildlife Fund, for instance. They're a very strong nature-based solution partner. So what are their strengths? What are our strengths? And what can we both bring to the table? I think is critical to develop that reciprocal relationship to help us sort of meet needs or fill gaps. I also think it's really important to have some sort of like governance structure around partnerships. It's great to be able to work with different partners, but just even the boring stuff of like who does what when, I think is really important to help us manage that partnership, and of course like giving credit where credit is due. I think sharing the credit across different partnerships, I think that really builds good rapport, good trust. So I think those are the kind of my strategies in terms of developing or working with partners. And speaking of a critical critical scientific body or partner, Julie, let me ask you. You've been engaged with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, also known as IPCC. If you can tell us a little bit more about what IPCC does and how you've engaged with them, and some of the sort of like the up and coming or interesting ideas on climate risk and resilience that you think might be on the table for us over the next couple of decades.
Yeah, very happy to. So the IPCC is a group that probably everyone on this call has never heard of, but it is an intergovernmental body. So basically, it's a body that was established by the UN years and years ago. Government said we need to understand what is the state of climate change. And in order to do that, we want to convene this neutral, fact-based entity that will tell us what that state of climate change is. And so that's the IPCC. And we're currently in the 7th assessment cycle. So what that means is it's the 7th time assessing and updating what we know about the state of climate change. And there's many facets to how these assessments run. It's, very detailed assessment of what we know about the Earth system and how climate change operates within the Earth system, to how it impacts people in society, to how our progress is being made on reducing emissions, etc. And this body essentially creates what's considered the authoritative source of the state of information. It's not creating new research, but it's reviewing all the research that's out there, synthesizing that information, and then writing a report. The report takes about a couple of years because it's a lot of information to go through. And that becomes a sort of authoritative source of what we know. And that source of information then is meant to inform policy negotiations at the international level in terms of the way in which governments respond to the challenge of climate change. So some of you may remember the Paris Agreement from 2015. That's one of the landmark examples of the type of policy that is created under a group called under a parallel group called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is like the policy-making arm of international climate change negotiations, and then the IPCC is the science arm that informs the policy arm, basically. So the way it operates is they, governments, civil society can nominate experts to be part of this process. Experts are selected, and then they volunteer their time to undertake this assessment and write this assessment. And they make a strong effort to balance perspectives, whether that's the country perspective, whether it's gender, whether it's area of expertise within climate change, of which there are hundreds of different ways you can consider yourself a climate expert, etc. So one of the ones that I'm involved in two of these reports at the moment. One is looking at the impacts of climate change in the context of cities. What do we know about framing that topic? What do we know about the trends coming from history to today? What are the effective solutions that we can use to adapt in cities or reduce our emissions in cities? How do we enable those solutions? And how do the nuances then apply across regions? And then another one of the reports that I'm involved in is more on the core physical science. What are some of the updates we know about changes to hazards, what we anticipate in the future, etc. So anyway, that's a lot of background on what that process is. And like I said, there are other groups that look at the impacts on society and how we're reducing emissions. But while we don't talk about like the detailed topics that are being discussed in those reports, we can talk about what's publicly available. And so some of the key issues on the horizon, which the reports are being have chapters centering on, are quite interesting topics. I'll just be very brief with them because I know we're coming to time to switch over to question and answer soon. One of them is the topic of overshoot. This is something we are going to be hearing a lot about in the coming years and even centuries. So if you remember the Paris Agreement, where governments around the world they essentially agreed how much warming they were willing to accept. And then there were efforts to try and keep our emissions under that warming level. We are in the process of surpassing that warming level. The level that was agreed was the level that was considered, for lack of a better word, like an acceptable risk that could be adapted to. And so now the question is, how much will we exceed that? What will be our peak? What will be the extent of impacts that we would like to avoid, but we haven't been able to avoid? But then also, what will be the process of hopefully having technology or emissions reductions that help us to eventually decline from that peak and return to lower levels, a more stabilized climate, not necessarily the climate we have today, because there could be major shifts that happen along the way as we go up and try to come back down. But then how do we try to think about or analyze what these different patterns will look like over the coming century or more, to also help society prepare. There's a huge amount of uncertainty and nonlinearity potentials and all of that, but it's one of the key things. And if you're really interested in that topic, a different part of the UN is going to be releasing an overshoot report very soon, that I would highly recommend taking a look at, because it will be a key one. Another topic that we've already been talking about for a few years, but we will keep talking about for years, is the way in which, and this is a more near-term thing, the way in which unprecedented events continue to happen, like I mentioned earlier, but also the way they cascade and compound on each other. There was at least one person who's in the Northeast, so the Northeast right now is experiencing some degree of extreme heat, not as hot as it was a couple of weeks ago, but also wildfire smoke from Canada, because there are wildfires in Canada at the moment. And so this compounding effect of these two different hazards, and then the cascading impact on health, for example, when these are both wildfire smoke and extreme heat are both things that can exacerbate health conditions. We will see lots more of this in the future, which has important preparedness and response considerations. And then I had two more, but I'll just say one more in the interest of time. There's then some topics that are continuing to grow that are kind of in the sci-fi category, but they continue to gain prominence, and one of them is something called solar radiation management, which is essentially there's one camp of this topic that says, can we put a thermostat on the globe as a temporary measure to avoid reaching highest temperatures, and they would argue to reduce impacts. And then there's another side of the argument on this one, and it's both a political and an academic research argument of, what are the risks and the uncertainties and the unknowns when you do that? Are we willing to accept them? And this is a topic that's actually been around for a long time, but it hasn't really been discussed in like a mainstream sort of way. It's still not fully mainstream, but it's definitely moving in that direction. And I think we will see more and more of that topic being discussed. And it has a lot of ethical governance policy questions, a lot of unknowns. And so I think it will be an area that continues to evolve as well, for example, over the coming horizon, decades, in terms of our understanding. So yeah, those are a few. Keeping an eye on the time here, and I wonder if we want to check if anyone has questions, including Jill, who has her hand up.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I have a couple of questions before I open it up to the audience. And I put some things in the chat. I put your climate center in the chat. I also put a wonderful video that Pablo Suarez made a long time ago. He used to be the director of innovation. And what he did is he said people who were in the area that he was working in had floods that used to be once every 9 years, and they were happening 3 or 4 times a year. And people whose livelihoods were chickens were losing their livelihood and also what they ate, because the chickens would drown every time there were floods. And instead of doing a scientific project and figuring out and doing a needs assessment and finding out, measuring and then making recommendations through a scientific report, he decided to ask the people in the region, the people affected by it, what they thought might be solutions. You know what they come up with? Ducks. Because ducks swim and they don't drown in floods. And not only were they able to, in the next year, raise ducks, but they were also able to have a livelihood and sell them at the local market. And so it became a solution to a nature-born challenge. And I'm always thinking of his video, which really speaks to, sooner than later, we need to come up with regional or local solutions and ask the people who are affected by them. And I think what you brought up was wonderful, because you brought up the themes that are going on right now, climate change being one of them, to solar radiation, which is a science fiction thing. But figure in the 1950s, we were seeding the environment so that we were trying to control the rain so that crops would grow. And that's 1952. We were artificially inseminating the beautiful clouds into providing water, or not lack of water in particular areas. So this has been going on since 1950s. But the question I have to you is, there a lot of people get confused between sustainability, adaptation. There are all sorts of, some people think that the thing that to do is to not use plastic water bottles. And that's a way of taking care of climate change. But they don't realize that isn't the only thing. And it's like being able to clear around their house to prevent wildfires from burning up their house. Or how do you make sustainable materials that keep your house cool when you live in a poverty-driven area where you don't have the materials or the money to fix it? And I think those are big, big challenges that we don't ever look at. But I also wanted to mention one other thing before I shut up and open it up to the audience to ask you questions. There's a wonderful organization called Solferino Society that exists in Geneva, I think. And what they do is they look at innovation, and Sean Hazeldine is the guy who does that. They look into innovation, and what they did is they did a contest for all the high school kids all over the world to create a 60-second video on the kind of climate challenge that they had in their country and to explain what they could do. So there was a young woman who was in a heat-driven place who talked about how to save yourself from heat prostration and being able to hydrate. There was somebody in a typhoon that said what you do, somebody in an earthquake region, and each one of them presented a video. And then I think there were 700 entries, and about he picked 50 videos that won, and they have 60-second videos that high school students made on how to protect yourself in various climate challenges. And so I'll put his name down in the chat, but I love that. For me, that was something that was really amazing. And I want to open it up to all of you who might have questions about your regions, about your chapters, about your area, but particularly to Julie and to Mashumi. Oh, I hope I pronounced your name right. Um, in terms of the talk today. So I open it up to people's questions. Please unmute yourself and ask whatever questions you want to ask. And don't be shy. Everybody is very loving in this group. Go ahead, Michael.
I guess my camera's not working.
Oh, no, it's okay. But go ahead and speak.
I was wondering, I'm familiar with the Red Cross and how it gets involved in hurricanes and fires and that sort of thing and setting up shelters. Do the Red Cross set up shelters now because of heat issues?
Yes, they do. Go ahead, Julie. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Julie, you can absolutely come in as well. So the Red Cross has been involved in two types of things, helping with cooling centers, but also overnight shelters. A very interesting example actually from that Pacific Northwest heat dome that I mentioned earlier. The Portland, I'm sorry, I don't get the right names of the chapters, but the area that covers Portland, they've engaged in both cooling centers and overnight shelters, and they saw substantially more people coming to the shelters, like hundreds of more coming to the shelters. And I think that's indicative of the value of being cool over the evening. It's indicative of people who without homes also need a place to go, of course, and a shelter is a great option for that, to get out of the heat. But I think also indicative of like, it can be a barrier to go from your house to a cooling center. Like that traveling, whatever journey that might be, can be a barrier in its own right because it's hot along the way. You may or may not have good transit. Maybe the transit is being affected by the heat, if it's, whatever it is. And so I'm hypothesizing now because they didn't interview people, but I think also the element of being able to go and just stay may have helped more people come to the shelters as well. And I know that there's been some work opening cooling shelters in Arizona as well recently. I don't know if anyone on the call is from that region and could say more to it, or even was involved in the Portland one a while ago. But those are some examples I'm aware of.
Anybody else have a question that they'd like to ask Julie or Mashumi?
I guess I can ask another one. I was wondering, what metrics do you use to evaluate success when you start a program to see how things have changed over time?
That's a great question. Mashumi, do you want to take that one and give some examples, even if it's from previous like work at care and that kind of thing I can come into?
I think the first step is to set up a baseline study, basically assessing what is the current situation. So if we take the example of heat, the baseline study, we can ask, the metrics could be, let's say the percentage of people in a neighborhood that has access to transportation to get to a cooling center. So that could be a metric. But then, once you have, let's say, once you've established the heat action plan, you've implemented the heat action plan, and then maybe in a year, you see whether that heat action plan has really helped people in terms of reducing their heat stress or their risk to extreme heat. And then you can use the same metric again, for instance, to see, are there more people going to these cooling centers? Is it because they now have more transportation than they used to? So again, you apply the same metrics in the baseline as you would to understanding impact. I think it really also, I mean, I'm sure there are, there's standard metrics that you can measure for sort of implementing heat action plans. One being, transport, cooling centers, access to information. I mean, there could be so many factors, but it also really depends on the context as well and the type of city and the challenges that people face. Julie, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think those are great responses. And if I mention adaptation more generally, in case that's also of interest, many of those will also apply to, whichever topic we're talking about. And then there can be things like there's a concept called limits of adaptation. So if you're implementing a solution, will that solution have longevity, for example? Is it a short term or will it last? If you implement that solution, will you have unintended consequences or not? And so being able to evaluate some of these things can also be really relevant in terms of impact in like a broader climate change adaptation sense, just to give a couple of illustrative examples.
What I was going to say also, Deborah Harper put in the chat that, for instance, in Volunteer Connection, our web encyclopedia, there's under one source, there's linked to concept of operations, which has to do with disaster. It's called extreme temperatures, and it's located if you search in the search engine under one source. So for those of you who are interested in finding that. And then the other, I think, let's see, Judy Boone has her hand, Boer has her hand up. Judy, do you want to get off mute and show your face and ask the question?
Well, don't die from looking at my face. But the question is, and I hope I'm not repeating something you've already said. The question is about data centers and their huge use of water and power versus their use to solve environmental problems.
I can take a first stab at that. I'm by no means an expert in this trade-off, and it's also such an emerging topic, but I've heard a couple of interesting anecdotes. One, of course, is acknowledging the huge resource intensity of data centers, for sure. Other anecdotes I've heard, there's one trade-off to consider of if we assume a world where they're going to exist, in the sense of like train has left the station, then you probably want them in places where they are governed better than where there are no governance mechanisms around their resource intensity. So that's one version of this debate. Another angle to this debate that I have also heard is, especially in the early days of setting them up, I don't know whether it's still happening, but there were some agreements between data centers and their host towns that gave data centers preferential treatment. So hypothetically, in the event of an extreme heat event, power and water sources would go to data centers first. And that's a huge risk, right? So understanding that dynamic and what those agreements are between the town and the data center can be really critical from a preparedness perspective. That has also gotten more recognition. So I don't know to the extent to which like, the local town halls are better capturing that and preventing it. The other thing I would say on the data center side is, I was at an event focused on AI advances for weather just a couple of weeks ago. so maybe this is the flip side of all of this. And it was just astonishing how much of a step change AI can provide in terms of weather and climate analysis. And it was a room full of weather agencies from around the world, other climate experts, and everyone was pretty close to speechless in terms of what some of the power of AI has been bringing into this space. And it's only been happening for a couple of years, like most AI. So it does raise a question of like, can we better understand different facets that we need to understand faster? Can that have usability in terms of our decision making in the world, or will political and governance processes go slow anyway? And I don't have answers to those, but it's another dimension. So that's a scattering of anecdotes that I have been in and heard over the past couple of months on this topic that might be of interest. I don't know, Mushumi, if you have others to add. I maybe took too many of them, but if you've heard others as well.
No, but yeah, no, not really. I mean, it's just I live in Washington, D.C., and Virginia, which is right next door, has some probably the most data centers in the US at the moment. And I was talking to a local resident from Virginia who's saying she really feels that it's gotten hotter because of those data centers. And she actually works on heat as well. But I don't think the discussion on extreme heat is really on the table, or the topic is not on the table yet in front of those decision makers who make decisions about where a data center will be. Yes, electricity, energy, water maybe, but again, like I feel like the heat topic is still very new to many cities, and we need to do more to connect those dots.
You mentioned a really good
I
point
have,
there. Oh yeah, please go ahead. I was just going to fill the time.
no,
Go ahead.
no, I was going to say, I want you to finish up, but I wanted to ask, finish up your question. But after that, I want to know sort of what could any of us do personally? Like, what should we be focusing on, not only within Red Cross, but in our own personal home to take care of the challenges that climate change brings, and ways to take care of ourselves, take care of our community, be careful about resources that we use, etc. But please go ahead, Julie, with your first finishing your question. Finishing your comment.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question that you're raising, Jill. I was just putting into the chat a recent news article to the point that Mushumi was making, there was an extreme heat event in the UK around the third week of June. It was their second red alert ever in their history, so it was quite extreme. And this news article came out about this extreme heat, this heat island effect of a local data center. So others might be interested in that as well. It's just a building on the point you were making, Mushumi. But Jill, to your point, I'm sure Mushumi has a lot to say there, and so do I. Do you want to go first and then I can come in, or what do you prefer, Mushumi?
Sure. I can go first. I mean, yes. Gosh, I feel like yes, of course, we can all do more to switch to renewable energy within our homes, for instance, or take public transport more than driving. So I think those we can do. We can make those changes happen, but and that's really from sort of contributing to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which is what's causing climate change. But from let's say, an adaptation and preparedness perspective, I think making sure when it comes to heat, for instance, making sure if you know where the cooling center is. So in case you lose power, you know where to go, for example, and you can help others, have that in mind. So I think there are things one can do, but I also think, we need people to do things at scale. So these individual actions are important, and I think we should all try our best. But it really boils down to I don't know whether it's a government or people or entities that have huge decision-making power to encourage us to make changes at a societal level. I think that's where we're going to see impact. Over to you, Julie.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. And I'll pick up that thread from where you left off. The societal level transformations are what will meet the moment of the societal level impact that climate change has, right? The fact that there's an EV network in the US means you can buy an EV car, means you can travel without using gasoline, for example. Like, that's not something that an individual can do on their own in the absence of the infrastructure. And there's, countless other examples that go along that line. So, in a personal capacity, because that was part of your question, Jill, considering the way you can engage in processes in the US or internationally that can create these systemic transformations, again, whether that's a government or whether it's a private sector or whatever, are so critical. And I think we see some of these transformations happening not only in the US, but around the world, like the, solar power coverage, to take another example, is something that, the more people that invest in it, the more research and development that goes into it, the better technology is, the more it scales. And we see it being, having transformed as a solution compared to 30 years ago. And that includes also government subsidies to help invest in that research and development, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing I would add, which is another emerging topic also, but it's coming back more to the individual side from a different angle. We hear more and more the topic of like climate grief. And so this is especially in the context of knowing that there are these many societal changes that need to happen. And while we're making good progress, there's a long way to go, knowing that we're going into a situation of overshoot and a concept called tipping, which I didn't touch on, but is another major potential transformation. We hear more and more about the topic of climate grief, especially among younger generations. And so keeping an eye out for each other in that sense, and trying to keeping an eye out for each other's mental health in that regard, but also finding ways to stay motivated, because we do make progress in these areas as society transforms. And so that's another important one, I think. And maybe that resonates with you as well, Jill, knowing your background.
Yeah, it does. It does. We talk a lot about climate grief, but and we also talk about what can we individually do to feel like we're making a difference when it seems all so overwhelming. Like, do we just work with sustainability, like making sure our light bulbs are not the, what do you call it, those funny zigzag light bulbs that cause lithium batteries? So to decrease our lithium battery light bulbs, do we, that's an individual thing we do. Do we bring, instead of getting plastic bottles, do we have a reusable container, or another form of container that doesn't destroy the environment? What do we do individually? How do we support our neighbors who constantly bring over, pallets, if you're having an outdoor party and they bring out, their 6-pack of plastic bottles? How do you say in a gentle way, oh, do you think we could use some other form, without insulting them and without getting them defensive? How do you educate people around you to be sure in terms of sustainability? And then adaptation, how do you do that within your own chapter or your own office? And keep up the energy level, because it's like a spiral downhill if you go Ain't It Awful, because there's so many Ain't It Awful stories, you know. So any suggestions any of you have, Oshumi or Julie or anybody on this call, anything that you think would be helpful when you're educating the public about climate change, or you're trying to educate your neighbor or support your family members in being cognizant of how they affect. One person can make such a difference. You know, it's do you know the 100th monkey theory? Have you ever heard of that? The 100th monkey? Okay, the 100th monkey theory is two islands near Ghana. And these monkeys lived on one island, and they cut up their nuts in a particular way. I think they were walnuts or some kind of nuts off trees that they had to break open in order to eat them. And at some point, an island 150 miles away, no monkey could have traveled that far by swimming, started adapting the same pattern. How did that happen? It's a research project that was done 20 years ago. And I'm still wondering how, at which point is the tipping point where you start doing a behavior and it stops. Just like we called ourselves Mr. and Mrs. And there was no Ms. And there was no he, she, or they. And suddenly the community has started changing. And now there's Ms., MS, not just Mr. and Mrs. Do you know what I'm saying? At what point does it become just ordinary and what I call a customary law, a law that's of habit, you know? Does that make any sense to you, what I'm saying?
Yeah, it does. If I can see if I summarize it back, I think you're approaching the concept of how can we turn our day-to-day actions and norms towards sustainability as we also work on the bigger system transformations, of course, because we can build on the experiences of other societal changes that have happened in our history and our living memory even, which I think is a nice concept to bring up. And I think we see some of those shifts happening also in the sustainability and environment space as well. We definitely move in the right, like the long-term arc is definitely moving in the right direction in that sense. Yeah.
If I could just add to that, I mean, I think media, I think oftentimes can really help in terms of, you know, building that knowledge for a wide audience. But I think one thing that I try and stay away from is taking on an alarmist approach where, you know, we're all going to collapse, the society's going to collapse if we don't do X, Y, and Z. And I think that's a real deterrent from people to take action to change their lives. So if we can, you know, explain, you know, what are the costs and what are the consequences of a certain action, I think that's a better approach than being like, we're all going to, you know, it's all going to be doomsday if we don't change. I think that's what I try to follow.
Anybody else have any comments about that? Thank you so much. That's great. I appreciate you saying that because it's discouraging sometimes, the ain't it awful part. Yeah. There was one thing I used to do is tell people to go hug a tree, you know, so that they could commune with nature, until I realized I didn't warn them about the poison oak or the poison ivy. Make sure you hug a tree and make sure it doesn't have poison oak or poison ivy on it before you go hug it, you know. It was like, that was one of my ways of taking care of myself and having ceremonies to trees or nature in honor of nature. Anybody else have any other questions that they want to propose to either Julie or Musumi, or any other comments that people want to make before we wind up? We have a few minutes left.
This is Lorene in Florida, and I really like you're seeking new ideas. My career before I retired in Chicago was in commercial banking international with clients from all over the world. Our tellers spoke 40 languages, and I had clients. It's so interesting. And I also taught financial literacy to students who lived with their family in low-income areas. So we had an idea. We worked with environmental companies, environmentalists, scientists, and we planned programs, and we would present them at a PTA meeting. And we had a slide presentation on changes that are happening to our environment. We had slides of Arctic, Antarctica, the West, everywhere, and different types of storms. It was so well received. It was replicated in other schools, targeting at-risk students. The parents came up afterwards and thanked us tremendously. So that's just something I'm throwing out to you.
I love that idea. I do. I think that's
Good.
amazing.
Yeah, it was
There's
wonderful.
there was in fact, Pablo Suarez, one of the actions he did, he went to a climate change conference in Washington, D.C. He was invited to the White House. And after 4 days of the conference and being slid to death, seeing slides over and over and over, he decided to do something different. So he went, I think, to a dollar store or someplace like that. And he bought about 12 Frisbees. And he started his talk in front of this group of scientists and governmental officials and NGOs. And he was to talk on hurricanes. And all of a sudden, he said, you usually for a hurricane, you have about 30 seconds warning when it's coming at you. And he threw the Frisbee. He said, that's the hurricane. And suddenly people were trying to grab the Frisbee to avoid the hurricane or protect themselves against the hurricane. And he started the dialogue that way. He broke into a very creative way of getting people to dialogue about that which is terrifying, and talk about what problem solving there could be rather than being on slides and being educated by slides. So I'm so grateful to you, Julie, and to Mashumi that you didn't do slides today because I think it's brought up so many questions that wouldn't have been, people I think would have been on their telephone or maybe working on their computer instead of listening to you. So I'm really grateful you didn't bring the slides on today. But
Well,
I think
if I could add something to that, the
please.
environmentalists, they actually brought the instruments that they used to measure changes so the children could walk around with their parents and pick them up. And I agree with you. There's nothing worse than a slide presentation. So when I left banking, I did go to the United States government and work and continued in working with children at risk throughout the United States and teaching them. We went to the dollar store and we bought all sorts of stuff and we labeled it $1, $2, $3, $4. And this is with a federal agency. They also worked on the project with me. And we asked the kids to go out. They had $10 to spend. Then they had to go back to their desk. They had the items, calculate the taxes, and then we printed out checks from piggy bank, and they had to write the check out and show us the calculation. It was hands-on experience to break the norm, to think outside of the box, because it's so important that our youth know that what they do can impact our world, Mother Earth. So I appreciate everything. I really enjoyed this. You ladies are to be commended. I respect intelligence. I'm just in awe of you, and thank you so very, very much.
I was going to mention one more thing that I think was really exciting. About 20 years ago, I was in Europe, and I ended up on a train in Europe. I think I even ended up in first class, and I was talking to the owner of the train system. It was a private train system, and he was showing me pictures of his daughter and how proud he was of his son and such. And I said, well, tell me about them. And he said, well, his daughter had come to him and yelled at him one day after class because she said the kind of gasoline he was using in the trains was spoiling the environment. And he said he started changing and researching and looking at science on what he could do about that because his daughter brought that up to him. And I think that's sort of inspiring. It's like we have the youth to sort of rely on in many ways to create things outside of the box, and to also challenge their families who have traditional ways of doing things that might not be so good for the environment.
Oh, that
So
is
anyway,
precious.
and what I would say is just to let you know, Julie and Mushimi, if you have any materials or any websites or anything that you think would be helpful to this group, send it on to me. And I will put it in the newsletter that goes out, the follow-up email with the recording of what you did today, for additional resources that people can use in their community or with their Red Cross or with their families. So anything that you think would be of use, feel free to send it on to me. I am just so grateful for you today. Anybody else, you have 5 minutes more. Anybody else have any burning questions or comments or ideas that they've used in their community? Please feel free to ask a question or comment. Going once. Going twice. Everybody who's on this call will get a follow-up email with a recording of this event. And Omargo is giving you a clapping. And so is it Patel, or is it Ashke or Patel? It's Ash. I can never pronounce your name. Can you unmute yourself and tell us who you are?
It's Akshay Patel.
Thank you. I'm so terrible at pronouncing names. I appreciate you coming off mute. Thank you. All right. I'll stay on a couple of minutes longer if anybody has any questions. Next month, Jeffrey Lone from the ICRC will be talking. And next week, you'll get a wonderful follow-up email with Julie and Ushumi. Did I do it right this time?
It's okay. No worries.
Oh, is it Mushumi? It is Mushumi,
Yes,
right?
it
I did it
is.
right. Mushumi, with the recording of them speaking. And that's it, my friends. Thank you so much for being on here today. Have a
Thank you so
wonderful
much.